Marian Holt did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not look toward the window, where the carriage that would take her away from Rowan Hall already stood waiting with its lamps unlit in the grey wedding breakfast light. She set down her glass, still full, with both hands, and she set it down slowly, the way a woman sets down something she does not trust herself to hold much longer. 41 names had been spoken aloud in that room in the space of a quarter hour. Cousins, aunts, the vicar, 2 tenant farmers invited as a courtesy, the steward, the dowager's spaniel once, as a joke that drew laughter. Her name had not been among them. By the time the carriage reached the end of the drive, the Duke of Rowan would have learned that a woman could leave a room more completely than any door could manage, and that some silences were not endured. They were delivered. The spring of 1817 had come to the county of Denbigh the way it always did, reluctant and grey-green, fog lying long in the water meadows until noon. It was the spring Marian Holt buried her father, and the spring, 6 weeks later, that she married a duke she had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in her life. Her father had been land agent to 3 estates and steward to 1, a broad, quiet man named Thomas Holt, who kept his ledgers the way other men kept scripture, in a hand so neat it looked printed, and who had raised his only daughter to read a rent roll before she could properly read a novel. When the fever took him in February, it took with it the one man in Denbigh who understood, to the shilling, what was owed to whom on 3,000 acres of difficult land, and it left behind a daughter of 25 who understood it just as well, and a duke who did not yet know that she did. Julian Vane, Duke of Rowan, had inherited a title, a house with 4 chimneys that smoked wrong, and 1,100 acres of water meadow that flooded with a regularity his father had, called an act of God, and his solicitor called a drainage problem no one had solved in 30 years. He had inherited, too, a doctrine, delivered to him at 12 years old by a father who did not believe in softening things for children. His own mother had left Rowan Hall in the night with a man who managed her jointure better than her husband managed his temper. And she had done it, his father told him, because she had never been loved so much as she had been useful. And the useful, once they found better use elsewhere, did not stay. Do not mistake being needed for being loved, his father had said, more than once, in the flat voice of a man reciting a lesson he had learned badly. It will cost you less to expect nothing. Julian had grown into that lesson the way a tree grows around a nail driven into it young, not removing it, only closing over it, until the wound and the wood were the same thing. He had married Marian Holt for water meadows and rent rolls, for a name in the county that meant her father's competence had not died with him. And he had told himself, with the particular carefulness of a man protecting an old injury, that this was an arrangement and not a risk. He had not lied to her about it. He had simply never once, in 6 weeks of courtship conducted mostly through his aunt and his solicitor, told her the truth of it either. She had married him anyway. Her father's cottage came with 2 years' unpaid rent she could not clear alone, and the water meadows that flooded Rowan's tenant farms were the same water meadows her father had drawn survey lines across for a decade, certain he knew how to fix them, and never given the money to try. Marian did not marry Julian Vane for love. She married him because it was, by every column of every ledger her father had taught her to keep, the soundest arrangement available to a clever woman, with no fortune, and a great deal of unused knowledge. She thought, on the morning of her wedding, standing in a borrowed gown, in a house that was not yet home, I will be useful to him. And she had believed then that being useful was a beginning, and not a verdict. Her father had left her one thing beyond the ledgers, a ring, a small garnet set plain in old gold, that had been her mother's, and that Marian wore always on a ribbon under her bodice rather than on her hand, because it was not, her father had told her once, a ring for showing. "It's a ring for remembering," he'd said. "Wear the other on your hand. Wear this one where only you can feel it." She had put it on the ribbon the morning her father died, and had not taken it off since. The wedding breakfast was held in the long dining room at Rowan Hall, windows fogged with the county's particular grey 40 guests, seated at a table built for 60. The new Duchess of Rowan, seated at her husband's right hand in a gown that had been remade twice from her mother's, and fit her, finally, like it had always meant to. Julian rose to make the toasts a little after noon, glass in hand, and Marian watched him do it with the specific attentiveness of a woman who has learned, from years of keeping her father's books, that the truth of a household is always in what gets recorded and what does not. He toasted his aunt, Lady Selina Vane, for her long care of Rowan Hall, in his minority. He toasted the vicar, for the ceremony well conducted. He toasted his cousin Edmund Cray, smiling thinly, for making the long journey up from town. He toasted the tenant farmers present, naming 2 of them outright, Sam Ferris and old Davy Loach, for the goodness of turning out on a working day. He toasted the cook, for the breakfast itself, which drew a general laugh and a scattering of applause. He did not toast his wife. Marian sat very still and watched him not do it, watched the moment arrive, and pass the way a gate is passed on a road one has walked before and knows the shape of. Somewhere down the table, Lady Selina's face did something complicated and quickly hidden. Somewhere nearer, Edmund Cray's mouth curved, very slightly, in the particular satisfaction of a man watching another man make his argument for him without being asked. Marian did not weep. She did not excuse herself. She reached up, beneath the high collar of her gown, and closed 2 fingers around the ribbon at her throat, around the small, hard shape of the ring that was not for showing, and held it there while the room settled back into its ordinary noise around a silence only she seemed to have counted. By morning, she thought, I will be at the water meadows, and he will still be here wondering why the house feels so quiet. And she was nearly right, though it would be longer than a morning before he understood what he had actually lost, and considerably longer than that before he learnt how to ask for it back. The room did not know yet what it had just watched. It would. Julian sat down to applause that had nothing to do with him, still holding his glass, already half aware, in the buried, inconvenient way a man is aware of a debt he has not yet totted up, that he had done something that could not be undone by simply doing it correctly next time. He looked toward his wife. Marian was already rising. She rose the way she did everything, without haste and without apology, her chair scraping once against the boards, and 40 faces turned toward her the way a field of grass turns. When the wind changes, she lifted her own glass, still full, since she had set it down and not touched it, not once, through the whole recitation of names that had not included hers, and held it a moment, considering the room the way her father used to consider a rent roll, before he found the error in it. I should like to make a toast, she said, since my husband has been thorough with everyone else this morning. A ripple went through the table, half laugh, half held breath. Lady Selina's hand went still on her fork. Edmund Cray's smile did not move, but something behind it did. To his Grace the Duke of Rowan, Marian said, and her voice did not shake, who has this morning shown his whole household with great precision exactly what he considers worth naming aloud. I am obliged to him for the clarity. It will save us both a great deal of time." She drank. She set the glass down, empty now, with the same steady two-handed care she had used on the full 1 minute before. Then she turned and walked the length of the table, past 40 guests who did not know whether to rise, past the housekeeper, Mrs. Dunmore, standing frozen in the doorway, with a tray in her hands, and out through the tall doors of Rowan Hall into a grey morning that smelled of rain not yet fallen. She did not look back to see whether her husband had risen to follow her. She already knew, the way she knew the sound of a wrong sum before she found it on the page, that he had not. Julian Vane sat at his own wedding breakfast with an empty glass in his hand, and a room full of witnesses to a mistake he did not yet have words for, and it was his aunt, finally leaning close, who said the only thing anyone said aloud in that whole frozen minute. "You had better go after her, Julian." He did not go after her. That, too, would take him longer to understand than it should have. Marian walked to the dower cottage at the edge of the home farm, her father's old cottage, half furnished still, its rent finally cleared by her own marriage settlement, and she did not cry there either. She permitted herself, standing in the cold front room with her wedding gown still on, exactly 10 minutes to feel the specific, complete humiliation of having been counted and not named. And she watched the clock on the mantel do its slow work, while she stood with her arms folded and her jaw set and her breath, twice, catching in a way she refused to call weeping. 10 minutes. Her father had taught her that too, in the last winter of his life, when grief had threatened more than once to swallow the both of them whole. Count it out, Marian, grieve on the clock, and then get up and do the next thing. Grief unrationed will spend you entirely, and there is always a next thing that wants doing. At the 10th minute she wiped her face once, decisively, with the flat of her hand, and she went to the small writing desk her father had used for 30 years, and she took out paper and a pen, and began. Not a letter to her husband, not yet, not for a long while yet, but a list. The water meadows, 300 acres, chronically flooded, no survey completed since her father's last attempt 8 years before. 40 tenant families paying reduced rent on land that could, properly drained, support twice the yield and clear itself in under 3 years. She wrote the figures from memory, because she had helped her father calculate them a dozen times over a dozen winters, and her hand did not shake once. She was still writing when Mrs. Dunmore knocked at the cottage door an hour later, out of breath from the walk, a shawl thrown hastily over her indoor cap, and stood in the doorway looking at the new Duchess of Rowan bent over a desk covered in figures, instead of weeping into a pillow, as any sensible woman in her position might have done. "Well," said Mrs. Dunmore, after a moment, in the flat voice of a woman who had run that household for 20 years and had opinions she rarely spent. "I'll say this for you, Your Grace. You're not what the house expected." "No," Marian agreed, not looking up. "I don't imagine I am." "He'll come round, in his own slow way. He's not a cruel man. He's a frightened one, wearing a cruel man's coat, and has been since he was a boy, though I'd deny I said it if you told him." Marian set down her pen at last. "I did not marry a frightened man's coat, Mrs. Dunmore. I married a duke who stood up in front of 40 people and forgot, out loud, that I exist. Those are different problems, and only one of them is mine to solve." Mrs. Dunmore studied her a long moment, the particular assessing stillness of a servant who has watched a great many marriages begin badly and a smaller number recover. And then she nodded once, the way one nods at a ledger that balances. "What do you mean to do, then?" Marian looked down at the paper covered in her father's remembered figures, in her own steady hand, and something in her chest that had been clenched since the dining room loosened by a single degree. "I mean to drain 300 acres of water meadow that has beaten every man who's tried it for 30 years, she said. "And I mean to do it without asking His Grace's permission, since he did not think to ask mine for anything this morning." Mrs. Dunmore's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That'll take money, Your Grace. It will take £400, 18 months, and 40 tenant families willing to trust a steward's daughter over a duke's dining-room manners," Marian said. "I have the first because it was my father's, and my settlement is my own to spend. I believe I can manage the second too." She rose from the desk and folded the list and put it into the pocket of a gown that was no longer a wedding gown, but simply a gown, the particular transformation of a garment losing its ceremony and gaining its purpose, and she went out to find Sam Ferris, who farmed the worst flooded 40 acres on the estate, and who had been, that very morning, one of the 2 tenants Julian Vane had troubled himself to name. The knock came at his door before supper. Sam Ferris opened it with his hat already half off his head from habit, and stood there blinking at the new Duchess of Rohan, standing on his threshold in the last of the daylight, alone, without a footman, without an announcement, holding a folded paper in her hand like a woman who meant business and did not intend to wait for permission to begin it. "Mr. Ferris," Marian said, "I understand your bottom field has flooded every winter for 11 years running. 12, Your Grace, if you count the dry one that weren't dry so much as merciful. I should like to walk it with you tomorrow at first light if you're willing. I have some ideas about the ditching, and I'd rather hear from the man who stood in the water than guess at it from a map." Sam Ferris turned his hat over once in his hands, the particular slow consideration of a working man deciding whether to trust a stranger with something that had cost him 12 winters of grief, and then he looked past her, briefly, toward the great grey bulk of Rowan Hall, on its rise above the meadows, its windows just beginning to light for evening. "His Grace know you're out here asking, ma'am?" "His Grace," said Marian, "did not think to ask my name aloud this morning in front of 40 witnesses. I am not in the habit tonight of asking his permission for anything at all." Something in Sam Ferris's weathered face shifted, not quite a smile, but its close cousin, the particular expression of a man recognizing, for the first time, that help might be arriving from an unexpected direction, and might, this once, actually be useful. "First light, then," he said. "I'll have my boots on." She walked back to the dower cottage in the last grey light, with the ring still cool against her skin beneath her collar, and she did not look toward the hall, though its lit windows followed her the whole way like something waiting to be answered. She had work to do. That was the whole of what she allowed herself to think, the sentence she had learned from her father in the worst winter of her life, and now spent again like a coin she trusted absolutely. She had work to do, and grief, rationed and spent, made room for exactly that. First light found her at the bottom field, in her oldest boots and her plainest cloak, a survey chain borrowed from her father's old effects looped over one shoulder, and Sam Ferris already waiting at the gate with 2 more men he'd rousted from the neighbouring cottages without being asked, because word travels through a tenantry the way water moves through a badly drained field, swift, low, and toward whatever will take it. The problem once Marian saw it with her own eyes, and not merely on her father's old survey papers, was not the river, as 3 generations of Rowan land agents had assumed. It was a single blocked culvert under the old drove road, silted shut since before her father's time, forcing every winter's water sideways across 40 acres that would otherwise have shed it clean into the millstream. Her father had suspected it. He had never had the £8 it would cost to dig down and confirm it, nor a duke willing to spend £8 on a tenant's field instead of a new pair of carriage horses. Marian had £8. It was, in fact, very close to the exact sum of pin money her marriage settlement allowed her for the quarter, and she spent every shilling of it that week on labour and tools without once sending word up to the hall, and by the second week Sam Ferris's bottom field had a culvert running clear for the first time in a generation, and word of it had begun, the way water does, to move sideways through the whole estate toward every ear that would take it. Marian Holt, the tenants said to one another, in the low voices of people accustomed to being unheard by their betters, and startled to find one of their betters actually listening. Marian Holt, the new Duchess, had walked 40 acres of bottom field in her own boots at first light, and paid out of her own purse, and known, from a stack of old papers, exactly where the water was going wrong before any man on the estate could tell her. The Duke, in the meantime, sent no word to the dower cottage at all. He told himself, in the flat interior voice his father had taught him young, that this was the arrangement working as it should, a wife occupied with her own concerns, a household running itself, no scenes, no demands. He told himself this at his breakfast table, alone, for 6 mornings running, in a dining room that had somehow become very quiet since the day it had held 40 guests and a toast that had gone. Everyone now seemed to agree without saying so aloud, badly wrong. It was his aunt, Lady Selina Vane, who finally broke the silence over the 7th breakfast, setting down her teacup with a precision that told him, before she spoke a word, that she had been saving something. "The tenants are calling her the Duchess of the Ditches, Julian," she said. "I mean that as a compliment, whatever it sounds like. Sam Ferris's field hasn't stood dry in November, in living memory, and it stands dry now. And she did it in a fortnight with pin money while you sat here eating toast." Julian set down his own cup more carefully than the remark warranted. "I am aware my wife is resourceful." "Are you aware she is your wife?" Lady Selina asked. "Because I confess, Julian, I could not tell it from the dining room a week ago Tuesday." He did not answer that. He rose, instead, and went to the window that looked out over the home farm, and, beyond it, the long silver gleam of water meadow that had troubled Rowan Hall for 30 years, and found himself looking, without entirely meaning to, for a small figure with a survey chain over one shoulder, moving along the ditch line in the cold morning light like a woman with no need of him at all. Something in his chest did the particular thing it had not done in a very long time, not quite pain, not quite alarm, but the cold, clean recognition of a man realizing, very late, that he has misplaced something he had assumed was fixed in its place and would wait for him indefinitely. He did not go down to the water meadow that morning. He told himself there was estate business to attend to in the study, and there was, in fact, a great deal of it, correspondence from his solicitor, a matter of the autumn rents, a letter from his cousin Edmund Cray proposing a visit that Julian read twice, without quite absorbing, distracted as he was by the sound, carried faintly on the wind through the open window, of a woman's voice giving instructions to men who were, unmistakably, listening to her. He watched from the window instead, for the better part of an hour, and told no one that he had, and this, the narration would note plainly, since the Duke himself would not, was the first small coin of noticing, and it did not weigh much, laid alone on the scale. It would take a great many more before the scale moved. But it was the first, and first coins, unlike later ones, are the hardest to spend honestly, because a man convinced of his own indifference must first admit he has been counting at all. By the end of that second week, the bottom fields stood dry through a full week of rain that would, in any previous November, have put it under 4 inches of standing water, and Sam Ferris walked the boundary of it twice a day, simply to look at ground he had never before trusted to hold his boots without sinking. It was Sam who came, hat in hand, to the dower cottage on a Saturday evening, turning his hat over and over in his big weathered hands in the particular way of a man working up to a thing he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "There's talk, Your Grace," he said, "of doing the same up along Cray's Hollow. 12 families up that way, flooded worse than mine ever was. But it's dear work, and I don't like to presume—" "You are not presuming, Mr. Ferris," Marian said. "You are reporting a problem to the person best equipped to solve it. That is precisely what I should like every tenant on this estate to feel free to do." Cray's Hollow. She turned the name over once in her mind, the particular half-attention a person gives a name they have heard before, without quite placing, and did not think much more of it that evening, though she would, before very much longer, have cause to think of very little else. When she learned that the hollow bore its name not from any accident of geography, but from her husband's own cousin, Mr. Edmund Cray, who held an old lease on the mill at its foot, and a great deal of quiet interest, it would later prove, in seeing that particular 12 acres remain exactly as flooded and as worthless as they had always been. For now she only wrote the name at the bottom of her list, beneath the culvert and the boundary ditch, and the account of £8 spent and already, in yield, returned threefold, and she went to bed in her father's old cottage, with the ring cool against her collarbone, and the particular satisfaction of a woman watching a plan compound, one small proof at a time, the way interest compounds in a ledger her father had taught her to read before she could properly read anything else at all. The work at Cray's Hollow began within the fortnight, and it was there, wading a boundary ditch in borrowed boots, beside 12 tenant families who had stopped expecting help from the Hall years before, that Marian first understood the shape of the problem was larger than water. The land records for the hollow, when she finally sent to the county office for them, did not match the boundaries anyone on the ground could show her. A strip of drainage easement that should have run along the mill stream, granted to the tenantry 2 generations back by Julian's grandfather, appeared nowhere in the current deed book at all, as though it had simply been allowed, over the years, to be forgotten by everyone whose interest it did not serve. It served Edmund Cray's interest a great deal that it be forgotten. He held the mill lease at the foot of the hollow on terms that made the standing water, if anything, convenient to him. An idle wheel meant fewer disputes over water rights, and a flooded 12 acres meant 12 families too occupied with survival to trouble a landlord's cousin about anything at all. Marian did not yet know this. She only knew that the paper did not match the ground, and that a mismatch of that particular kind, her father had taught her in a dozen winters of shared ledgers, was never an accident. Paper does not lie by itself, Thomas Holt used to say. It is only ever made to. She wrote the discrepancy down, dated it, and said nothing of it yet to anyone at the Hall. It was in the 3rd week of the hollow work that Julian Vane finally came down from the house himself, on a grey morning with rain threatening, and found his wife standing calf-deep in a boundary ditch in an old cloak with mud to the knee, directing 4 men with a competence that made him stop at the gate and simply watch her for a full minute before she noticed him at all. "Your Grace," she said, when she did, and there was nothing in the 2 words for him to hold on to, not warmth, not coldness, only the flat, correct address of a woman who had decided, with the same precision she brought to a rent roll, exactly how much of herself he had earned the right to see. "I heard about Ferris's Field," Julian said. "He had rehearsed several better openings on the walk down, and used none of them. I imagine the whole county has heard about Ferris's Field, Your Grace. Water finding its level is rather the theme of the last fortnight." He looked past her at the ditch, at the men working, at the 12 acres that had beaten his father and his father's father, and had evidently not beaten his wife. "I should like to help pay for it. The hollow work, I mean. It oughtn't come out of your settlement alone." "It hasn't," Marian said. "I have been keeping accounts, Your Grace, since I was 11 years old. I know precisely what this has cost, and precisely who has paid it, and I will show you the ledger whenever you care to see it. What I will not do," she added, and here, for the first time, something sharper moved under the flat surface of her voice, "is pretend that an offer of money 6 weeks after the fact settles a debt that was never about money at all." Julian was quiet a moment. A pause. Somewhere behind him a cartwheel creaked on the drove road, ordinary and indifferent to the 2 of them standing on opposite sides of a ditch that had become, without either quite choosing it, a great deal more than a ditch. "I know what I did," he said finally at the breakfast. "Do you?" Marian said, not a question. A verdict, delivered the way she delivered all her verdicts, without heat. "I have known it every morning since, at that table, alone." He stopped. Started again, the words coming slower, the way a man speaks when he is translating something out of a language he has not used in a long while. "My father raised me on the idea that the useful do not stay for anything but their use, because it was true once, in this house, of someone I loved very much. I have spent 20 years making certain I never mistook the one for the other again. I mistook it in the other direction instead, and I did it to you, in front of 40 people, and I cannot undo the room. But I would like to be told what I might do that isn't merely money." Marian looked at him a long moment, mud on her boots, and the ring cool against her collarbone, and 12 acres of drying ground behind her, that she had built with her own 2 hands, while he sat alone at a table wondering, apparently, how to say any of this at all. "Show me," she said. "Not today, and not with words. Show me over time, the way water shows a field where it truly wants to go, not in a single flood, but in a season of it, running the same direction every day, whether anyone is watching or not. Words are cheap, Your Grace. You spent 40 of them on other people in a single breakfast, and not one on me. I find I no longer value them at their old price." He absorbed that the way a man absorbs a blow he knows he has earned, without flinching, without arguing the sentence, only standing in it. "All right," he said. "All right, then," Marian said, and turned back to the ditch, and that, for the moment, was the whole of the treaty between them, 2 words each, and a season still to be walked before either one meant anything at all. He did not leave at once. He stayed at the gate another quarter-hour, watching, and before he left he took off his own coat, without announcement, and rolled his sleeves, and went down into the ditch himself to help carry stone for the culvert lining until the light failed, and said almost nothing more the whole time, only worked. The particular silent labour of a man who had finally understood, watching his wife not once look up to see whether he approved, that approval was not the currency being asked of him at all. Word of that, too, moved through the tenantry by evening, the way water moves downhill. The Duke of Rowan had waded a ditch alongside Sam Ferris and asked no one's permission, and taken no credit for it, and had gone home muddy to the knee without a word to anyone about what it meant. It was 3 days after that, in the estate office at the Hall, going through his father's old papers in search of the original grant for the hollow easement, that Julian found the letter that would, before the summer was out, undo a great deal more than a flooded 12 acres, a letter in his own mother's hand, dated the week before she left Rowan Hall for good, addressed not to a lover, as he had been told his whole life, but to his father, and never sent. He read it twice before he understood what he was holding. Then he sat very still for a long time in the failing afternoon light, the paper motionless in his hands, and did not, that evening, know how to begin telling anyone what he had found. He carried the letter with him for 2 days before he could make himself act on it, the particular cowardice of a man who has built 20 years of certainty on a story and is not yet ready to watch it dissolve. On the 3rd evening he walked down to the Dower cottage himself, in the dark, and knocked, and stood on the step turning his hat in his hands the way Sam Ferris did, a gesture he had never once, in his own recollection, made before in his life. Marian opened the door herself. She did not ask him in at once. She looked at his face, at the paper he held, and something in her, the particular instinct of a woman raised on ledgers, that a man carrying a document at that hour was carrying either a debt or a confession, made her step back and let him pass. "I found this in my father's papers," he said, once the door was shut, and he did not sit, only stood by the cold hearth with the letter held out like something that had grown too heavy for one hand. "It is my mother's. She wrote it the week she left. She never sent it." Marian took it, and read it by candlelight, and understood within 3 lines why he had not been able to speak of it on the walk down. The letter was not a lover's farewell. It was a wife's accounting, of a husband who had spent a decade calling her extravagance, calling her unfaithful before she ever gave him cause, until she had finally done. In despair, what she had been accused of for years, because a woman told long enough that she is only tolerated for her use will eventually test whether that is true. "I did not leave because I stopped loving this house," she had written. "I left because I was told so many times and in so many ways that I was never loved by it at all, only endured, and I grew tired of proving otherwise to a man who had already decided the verdict before the trial began. He told me she left because she was faithless," Julian said into the silence after Marian set the letter down. "He told me that every year of my boyhood, until I built my whole understanding of women, of marriage, of you, on the strength of it. And she was only ever answering the same accusation back to him that I made to you at that breakfast table 6 weeks ago, without even the excuse of having been driven to it first." Marian did not offer him comfort, not yet, though something in her had softened, watching him stand there with his mother's 20-year-old grief in his hands, and no longer any doctrine to hide it behind. "Not because you were cruel," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, the way she worked out a column that would not balance, "but because you were taught, by someone who needed the lesson to be true, that love and use could never be the same thing at once. Your father built that lie to survive his own failure, and you have spent your whole life paying a debt that was never yours to owe." "That does not undo the breakfast," Julian said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But it tells me what I am dealing with, and that matters more than you may think. A cruelty, is a wall. A wound, properly understood, is a door. I did not marry a wall, Your Grace. I begin to think I may have married a door that has simply never once, in 20 years, been asked to open." He looked at her a long moment in the candlelight, and something behind his eyes moved. Not quite hope. Not yet, but its careful, unarmed cousin. "I would like to try," he said. "Not tonight. I understand tonight buys nothing. But I would like the season you spoke of, if you'll still grant it." "You already have it," Marian said. "You've been in it 3 weeks. I have simply not yet told you whether you are passing." She kept his mother's letter, folded inside her own writing desk beside her father's old survey papers, and did not yet tell him that the discrepancy she had found in the Hollows deed book sat in the very same drawer. Because that reckoning, unlike this one, was not his to soften, and belonged, she had already decided, to a much larger room than a cottage parlour lit by a single candle. Edmund Cray arrived at Rowan Hall 11 days later, exactly as his letter had promised, with a leather case of papers he described, over dinner, as a matter of tedious family business. A query, he said, smiling his smooth-poured cream smile down the table, about the original terms of the Holt marriage settlement, which his own solicitor had flagged as irregular in a way that might, unattended to, cause difficulty for the estate. Marian had learned enough in 6 weeks of reading her way through Rowan's neglected paper to recognise the particular stillness of a man laying groundwork rather than making conversation, and she said very little across the soup, and watched him instead the way she had once watched a column of figures she suspected of hiding an error. The difficulty, when Cray finally produced it 2 days later in the estate office, took the shape of a document, a supposed codicil to Thomas Holt's own estate, dated the winter before his death, purporting to show that the elder Holt had died substantially in debt to a firm of London creditors. Debt that, Cray explained with real seeming regret, would by law attach itself to any property or settlement passing through his daughter, including, potentially, her portion of the Rowan marriage settlement itself. "I only bring it forward," Cray said, "because I should hate for it to surface later, in less friendly hands, and embarrass the family." He said family the way a man says a word he has practised enjoying the taste of. Julian read the paper twice, his face doing the particular arithmetic of a man weighing a threat against a marriage 6 weeks old and still finding its feet, and it was Marian, watching him from across the desk, who spoke first. "May I see the signature, mister?" "Cray?" He passed it to her with the easy grace of a man certain of his ground. Marian studied it a long moment. The loop of the H, the particular slant her father had held steady across 30 years of ledgers she had watched him fill since she was old enough to hold a pen at all, and set it down with the same two-handed care she had once used to set down a full wine-glass she did not trust herself to drink from. "That is not my father's hand, Mr. Cray," she said. "I have several 100 pages of his hand in my own writing desk this moment, spanning 20 years, and I have read every one of them more times than I can count. My father crossed his sevens continental fashion, a habit from his own father's Dutch training in surveying. Whoever wrote this did not know that, and wrote an English 7 throughout. It is a small thing. It is also the whole of the matter." The room went very quiet. A pause long enough that even Cray's composure, poured cream smooth as it was, showed the faint crack of a man watching a plan built over months collapse over a single stroke of a pen he had never thought anyone would examine closely enough to notice. "I hardly think a stroke of the pen," he began. "I think a great many things turn on a stroke of the pen, Mr. Cray," Marian said. I was raised by a man who believed exactly that, and taught to notice when someone was hoping I would not look closely enough to agree with him." She turned to her husband. "I should like this document examined by a solicitor of our own choosing, your Grace, not Mr. Cray's, and I should like it done before the county quarter sessions, in the open, where anyone with a claim to make against my father's memory may make it in daylight." Julian looked at his cousin for a long moment, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, adding up a lifetime of small favours and small debts and small unexplained kindnesses from a cousin who stood, he now recalled with the sick clarity of hindsight, to inherit Rowan entire should this marriage fail to produce an heir or dissolve in scandal first. "Yes," Julian said. "We will have it examined. In the open, as my wife says." Cray's smile did not move, but something behind it, for the first time since he had arrived at Rowan Hall 11 days before, went still and calculating in a way that no longer troubled to hide itself, and he left the estate office without another word about family, or embarrassment, or the tedious matter he had come so smoothly prepared to press. He did not leave the county. That, Marian understood without being told, was very much the point. Mr. Aldous Pratt, the solicitor Marian sent for from the county town, was a small precise man with ink-stained fingers and a horror of imprecision so complete it amounted almost to a moral position, and he spent 4 days with her father's genuine papers spread across the estate office table before he would commit himself to an opinion on anything at all. "The document Mr. Cray presented is a forgery," he said finally, laying it flat beside 3 verified samples of Thomas Holt's hand, and not, I would say, a skilled one, examined properly. "The 7 is wrong throughout, as her Grace observed. The paper itself is of a stock not sold in this county before 1815, a full year after the date it claims. And the debt it describes, to a London firm I have written to directly, does not exist in their books at all. Whoever manufactured this did so in some haste, and did not expect a woman who could read her father's ledgers to be given the chance to examine it closely. They did not expect a Duchess to look at all," Marian said. "That has rather been the pattern of the summer. It was in the course of that same week, sorting through the last of her father's papers for anything further Pratt might need, that Marian found the second document, not a forgery this time, but the genuine original grant, 60 years old, establishing the drainage easement along the mill stream at Cray's Hollow, exactly as the tenants had always claimed, and the current deed book had somehow, conveniently, ceased to record. It bore the seal of Julian's own grandfather, and a margin note in a hand she now recognised, with a small cold jolt, as belonging to a much younger Edmund Cray, dated 8 years back, noting that the original had been removed to the muniment room for safekeeping, and never, the record showed, returned. Edmund Cray had been quietly rewriting the paper of Rowan Hall for the better part of a decade, a forgotten easement here, an inflated mill lease there, small enough thefts of record that no single one had ever drawn scrutiny, all of them compounding, patiently, toward a day when the estate's confusion might become his opportunity. Particularly if a marriage 6 weeks old could be made to founder on a manufactured debt before it produced an heir to stand permanently between himself and the title. Marian laid both documents side by side on the estate office table that evening. The forged codicil, and the genuine easement Cray had quietly stolen from the record 8 years before it ever occurred to him he might need to discredit her father too, and understood, with the particular clean satisfaction of a woman watching a column finely balance, that she now held everything required not merely to defend her father's memory, but to answer, in full, the debt Cray's Hollow had owed its 12 families for 8 long years. The autumn quarter sessions, she said to Julian that night, are in 11 days. I should like to bring both documents before the whole county at once, not merely a solicitor's office. Mr. Cray has spent a great deal of care making certain no single piece of this would ever be examined in the light. I find I should like to give him a great deal of light at once. Julian looked at his wife across the desk, at the 2 documents she had assembled with nothing but her father's teaching, and her own patience, and felt the particular vertigo of a man realizing that the woman he had once described to his solicitor as a sound arrangement had in fact been quietly saving his entire inheritance while he ate breakfast alone and called it peace. "Whatever you require," he said, "the quarter sessions, the hall, the tenantry, whatever proof you need, you will have it, and you will have it as my wife standing beside me, not behind me. I have made that error once already. I do not intend to make it twice." The quarter sessions were held, as they always were, in the long assembly room above the county hall in Denby Town. And on the appointed morning it was fuller than anyone could recall it being in a decade, for word had gone through the county, the way water moves downhill, that the new Duchess of Rowan meant to answer, in public, a question that had been whispered about her father's memory for a fortnight, and half the county had come to see how a steward's daughter would manage a room built for gentlemen's disputes. She managed it standing. Marian rose when the matter of the Holt codicil was called, in a plain grey gown with no ornament but the ribbon at her throat tucked, for once, visible above her collar, and she did not raise her voice once through the whole of it. She laid the forged document on the clerk's table beside 3 genuine samples of her father's hand, and asked Mr. Pratt to speak to the paper stock and the false 7, and ask the London firm's own written reply, which she had brought with her, to be read into the record stating plainly that no such debt existed in their books. Then, before the magistrate could close the matter, she asked one further question, addressed not to the room but directly to Edmund Cray, seated near the back with his usual smooth composure, only slightly dimmed. "Mr. Cray, you mentioned to his Grace that your own solicitor flagged this codicil as irregular. Might the room have the name of that solicitor, so that Mr. Pratt may write to him and confirm the document's provenance?" Cray did not answer at once. A pause, long enough for the whole room to feel its weight. "I do not recall precisely which clerk handled the matter," he said finally. "That is curious," Marian said, "since the codicil is written on paper not sold in this county before 1815, and dated a full year earlier than that. I wonder whether your solicitor, whoever he was, noticed that also, or whether he was never consulted on the codicil at all, and only on the easement records you removed from this county's muniment room 8 years ago and never returned." She laid the second document on the table beside the first, the genuine grant, 60-year-old seal intact, Cray's own younger hand recorded in the margin, and the room, which had been merely attentive until that moment, went entirely still in the particular way of a crowd recognizing, all at once, that it is watching a true reckoning rather than a rehearsed one. It was Sam Ferris who spoke next, rising unbidden from a bench near the back, where a dozen tenants from the Hollow had come to watch, twisting his hat in his hands the way he had that first evening at the Dower Cottage door. "Begging pardon, your worship," he said to the magistrate, "but I can speak to the water rights myself if it's wanted. My father held that easement before me, and told me of it as a boy, and I've paid Mr. Cray's mill toll every autumn, these 8 years, for water that weren't ever his to charge for. Because there weren't no paper to show otherwise. There's paper now. 2 more tenants rose after him, unasked. And then a third, the room's murmur rising and falling like water finding a new channel, and by the time the magistrate called the room back to order, something in Edmund Cray's face had gone still in a way that was no longer composure at all, but its collapse, a man watching 8 years of patient small theft undone in a single morning by a steward's daughter with a survey chain and a habit of reading margins. The magistrate did not require a long deliberation. The codicil was struck from any standing against the Holt estate or the Rowan settlement. The easement at Cray's Hollow was restored to record, effective immediately, and the mill tolls collected against it for 8 years ordered repaid, with the county's own auditor to oversee the reckoning. Edmund Cray was not, in the end, charged with any crime the room's evidence could firmly prove. The paper trail led everywhere but to his own hand on the forged codicil itself, however plainly it pointed to him on the easement. And it was Marian, when the magistrate asked whether the family wished to press the matter of the codicil's authorship further, who answered before Julian could. "No, your worship," she said. "I should like the record corrected, and the tenants repaid what is theirs. What Mr. Cray has cost himself today, in this room, is a great deal more lasting than anything a further charge could take from him, and I find I have no wish to spend more of the county's time on a man who has already spent his own credit entirely. It was mercy, and the room understood it as mercy, and understood too, watching her deliver it standing perfectly still, with nothing raised but her chin, that it was mercy dispensed from a position of complete and undeniable power, which is the only kind of mercy that costs the giver anything at all. Edmund Cray left the assembly room before the session closed, and left the county within the fortnight, and was not spoken of again in Denby except as a cautionary figure invoked occasionally by mothers warning sons against the particular vanity of believing paper unwatched stays unwatched forever. Julian rose, once the room began to empty, and crossed to where his wife stood, gathering her documents back into their case with steady, unhurried hands, and he did not, this time, need to be told what was wanted of him. "I owe you an accounting," he said low, meant only for her, though half the departing room could likely hear it. "Not an apology only, an accounting. I should like to give it tonight, in full, if you'll hear it." "I distinguish between the two, your grace," Marian said, closing the case. "An apology says I am sorry for what I did. An accounting says I understand what it cost, and why, and what I intend never to do again. I have had apologies enough this summer from men who thought the word alone was the whole of the payment. I find I require both from you, or neither is worth having." "You shall have both," Julian said. Tonight he gave it to her that evening in the estate office at Rowan Hall, with the door shut and the candles burned low, and it took the better part of 2 hours, and Marian listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, because she had learned, over a summer of ledgers, that the truest accounting is the one a person is finally willing to give in full, without editing the parts that shame them. He told her of his mother's letter, in his own words this time rather than the papers, and of the 20 years he had spent building a doctrine out of another man's failure. He told her of the breakfast itself, admitting what she had already known, that he had rehearsed the toasts the night before, had written her name on the list in his own hand, and had, standing at the table with the wine already poured, felt the old cold arithmetic rise in him at the last moment, the fear that naming her aloud, in front of the whole county, was itself a kind of risk he had never before been asked to take, and had failed it, entirely, in the space of a breath, he could not now get back. He told her, too, of watching her from the study window in the weeks after, coin by coin, learning to notice what he had trained himself for 20 years not to. "I do not ask you to forget the breakfast," he finished. "I ask only that you let me spend the rest of the year proving it was the worst of me, and not the whole of me." Marian was quiet a long moment, turning the ring at her throat once between two fingers, the particular stillness of a woman weighing a full accounting, the way she had once weighed a column of figures that finally balanced. "Then I will state my terms," she said, "and I will state them once, plainly, and I should like you to hear them the way you heard your father's doctrine, as something you carry, not something you merely agree to for an evening's peace." "Say them," Julian said. "I will manage the estate's land and its tenantry as I have managed it these last 2 months, with full authority, and without needing your permission sought or your name invoked to make a tenant listen to me. I will keep my own accounts, and you will see them whenever you ask and never before. My name will be spoken in this house and before this county as often and as plainly as yours is, beginning at our very next gathering, and you will be the one to see that it is. And I will not mediate between you and your fear of being loved for your use rather than yourself. That is a debt owed to your own honesty, not to me, and I will not carry it for you the way your mother was made to carry your father's." "All right," Julian said. "All right then," Marian said, and something in the room, for the first time since a wedding breakfast 6 weeks before, felt less like a held breath and more like the beginning of an ordinary evening between two people who intended to have a great many more of them. There remained one debt still unpaid, and it was Lady Selina Vane who came to settle it herself, 3 days later. Finding Marian alone in the walled garden behind the dower cottage with a basket of late cuttings on her arm. "I taught him the doctrine as much as his father did," Lady Selina said, without preamble, the particular bluntness of a woman who had decided a thing was owed and meant to pay it before she lost her nerve. "After his mother left, it fell to me to raise him through the worst of it. And I told him, more times than I can now excuse, that affection was a luxury a man in his position could not safely afford. I believed it. I had reasons of my own to believe it, which are not yours to carry either. I only wished to say, plainly, that I am sorry for the part I played in building the man who stood at that breakfast table and could not make himself say your name. It was not only his father's failure, it was mine also." Marian set down her basket and studied the older woman a long moment, the particular courage it cost a proud woman to say a thing so plainly, without softening it or asking to be excused from its weight. "Thank you for saying it without being asked," Marian said. "That is worth a great deal more than if I had needed to ask for it." "What will you do now?" Lady Selina asked. "I mean to keep managing the water meadows," Marian said, "and I mean to let your nephew prove himself in the small hours nobody is watching, since that is the only proof I've ever trusted. And I mean, come harvest, to hold a supper for every family on this estate, tenant and gentry, both at the same table, and to see that every name in the room is spoken aloud before the evening is through. I find I have developed rather strong opinions on the subject." Lady Selina's mouth curved, the closest thing to a real smile Marian had yet seen from her. "I imagine you have. The season that followed was not dramatic. That, Marian had come to understand, was rather the point of it. Julian did not make speeches or grand gestures, he showed her, in the particular currency of ordinary days, that the accounting he had given was not a single payment, but an instalment plan he intended to honour, without being asked to renew it. He rose before her most mornings now, and had her tea poured before she reached the breakfast table, not because she required it, but because he had noticed, weeks before, that she took it a particular way and had simply begun remembering. He brought his own ledgers to the estate office and set them beside hers, not to check her figures but to learn her method, and asked more questions in a month than his father had asked in 30 years, of managing the same difficult land badly. He moved his chair, without comment, from the head of the dining table to the place beside hers, and left it there. There was one relapse, in late September, when a dispute arose over the timing of the autumn rents, and Julian, out of 20 years of old habit, rather than any new unkindness, settled it himself with the tenants directly, and told Marian of it only after the fact, over supper, as a piece of news rather than a decision shared. Marian set down her fork. You decided that alone. He heard it, this time, for exactly what it was, not a complaint, but a named pattern, offered to him the way she offered every discrepancy, plainly and without heat, so that it might be corrected rather than merely regretted. I did, Julian said, out of old habit, not old doctrine. I am sorry for it, and I will not do it again, and I would like, if you're willing, to go back to Sam Ferris tomorrow with you and settle it properly, the two of us together, so the tenantry sees it done that way, and not merely hears it was. That, Marian said, is precisely the correction I hoped for, and something in her chest, watching him name his own lapse before she had to press him to it, loosened by a degree she had not expected to feel loosened so soon. It was in early October, walking the boundary of the now thriving hollow fields at dusk, that Julian stopped on the drove road and turned to her, and said the thing he had been building toward, in instalments since the estate office 2 months before. I would choose you, he said. Not because you are useful to Rowan, though God knows you are, more than any land agent this estate has employed in a century. I would choose you if the water meadows had never flooded, and there had been no ledger to balance, and no forgery to expose. I have been choosing you, in fact, for some weeks now. Every morning I poured your tea before you rose, though I did not have the courage to say it plainly until I was certain you would believe it, and I find I am no longer willing to wait for certainty. I would choose you. I have been choosing you for some time. Marian looked at him a long moment in the fading light, the ring cool against her collarbone, the ditch behind them running clean and quiet, where it had once stood drowned for 30 years, and she reached up, for the first time since the wedding breakfast, and drew the ribbon out from beneath her collar so the ring hung visible in the open air between them. Then have it properly set, she said, and I will wear it where it can be seen. It was never a ring for hiding. It was only ever a ring for a man who had earned the right to see it. The harvest supper was held the 3rd week of October. Trestle tables set the length of the home farm's threshing barn. Tenant and gentry seated together for the first time in Rowan's long memory, 40 families, and more crowded in against the early dark, with lanterns strung along the beams. Julian rose to make the toasts a little after the meal, glass in hand, and the room, many of them the same 40 who had sat in the dining room 5 months before, went quiet in the particular expectant way of people who remembered exactly what had happened the last time this man stood to speak. He toasted Sam Ferris and the men of the Hollow. For 8 years' patience finally answered. He toasted Mrs. Dunmore, for a household kept steady through a difficult season. He toasted his aunt briefly, for a debt of her own honestly paid. Then he turned, and found his wife at the foot of the table, the garnet ring newly set in gold, and worn openly on her hand, and he raised his glass a final time. To my wife, he said, and his voice did not shake, though the whole barn had gone still to hear it, whose name I once stood in this house's own dining room and failed, entirely to say aloud, though I had written it on my own list the night before, and lost my nerve at the very moment it mattered most. I will not spend the rest of my life explaining that failure. I intend instead to spend it correcting it, one ordinary morning at a time, for as long as she will permit me the privilege. Marian Holt, Duchess of Rowan. I say her name gladly, and I mean to go on saying it, in this room and every other, for the whole of however long I am given. The room did not merely applaud. It rose, tenant and gentry together, the particular sound of a county recalibrating aloud. And Marian sat very still at the foot of the table, with her hand closed around a glass she did not, this time, need to set down untouched, and let herself, for the first time in 5 months, simply be seen. 2 years turned the water meadows green in a way no one under 60 could recall them being, and turned the Duchess of the Ditches, as the county still fondly called her, into the estate's acknowledged land agent, in fact, if never quite in formal title. Her ledgers consulted before any decision of consequence was made on 3,000 acres of difficult ground. Sam Ferris was made head tenant of the whole hollow holding, his rent fixed fair and posted, at Marian's insistence, on the estate office door, where any tenant might read it for themselves rather than trust it to rumour. A small school was begun in the old dower cottage's front room that winter, for tenant children who had never before had letters taught them, and Marian kept its accounts herself, in her father's neat continental hand, which she had, by then, taught herself to write exactly as he once had. The garnet ring stayed on her hand, worn openly, no longer a thing kept hidden for remembering alone, but a thing shown for the same reason. Because a ring, like a name, means nothing spoken once in a locked room, and everything spoken, plainly, in front of a whole county that has learned to listen. Rowan Hall, in those 2 years, lost the particular held-breath quality it had carried the whole of Julian's boyhood, and half his marriage besides. The cold rooms warmed, the chimneys drew properly at last, and Mrs. Dunmore, asked once by a visiting cousin why the house felt so different from the one she remembered, only said that a house is like a marriage. It does not breathe freely until the people inside it stop counting each other's use and start, instead, simply staying. Marian Holt had not asked, that grey wedding breakfast morning, to be forgiven for existing quietly in a house that preferred not to notice her. She had not asked, and she had not waited. She had built, instead, a life so plainly, undeniably her own that the noticing, when it finally came, was not a gift bestowed on her, but a debt collected, in full, on her own terms, and in her own time. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself impossible to unsee. And that, in the end, was not a thing any name spoken or unspoken over a wedding breakfast had ever had the power to take from her at all.